Good afternoon and welcome to the November 29th, 2021 Governing Board Study Session. We have just a few items on our agenda, but prior to the start, because we have a few action items, Mr. Sullivan, do you want to read the roll?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I'd be glad to. Maria Garcia.
Present.
Dr. Meredith Hay.
Here.
Luis Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, are you present? Catherine Ripley.
Here.
Damian Klinko.
Here.
So it looks like Mr. Gonzalez is the only board member not attending.
Okay, and if Mr. Gonzalez arrives, if you could just note that in the formal minutes. The first item is our action item 2.1, new certificate, non-destructive testing certificate. Mr. Sullivan, could you read the recommendation?
The Chancellor recommends the governing board approve the college to award certificates in non-destructive testing.
Do I have a motion to adopt the recommendation?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second, okay. Discussion. Mr. Lambert, if you'd like to give a brief overview, and then it looks like Ms. Garcia.
Yes. Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Chair and board members. And so we're excited to be able to offer, if based on your approval, this non-destructive testing piece. Not only does it work in the aviation sector, it also has application, as you note in the comments, in other sectors as well. And so this is exciting to be able to provide this additional offering for our students as well as for our employers and our community. If you want additional background, I'd be glad to have Dolores or Lamada, or if Jason is on, even have Jason speak to the particulars.
Okay, Ms. Garcia, looks like you have a question.
Yeah, I'd like to know what was the reason to implement this kind of a program? Who in industry requested it? And where's the facilities going to be to do it? And what type of non-destructive testing are you going to be performing?
So Board Member Garcia, this is Dolores. Hi. We had invited Jason Bowersock to join us too. I don't see him quite yet, but I can give you some information. This is something really new and innovative and for the college. And I think it has really great potential for our students, as the Chancellor said, not only in aviation, but what it is, it's a testing and analysis technique used by industry to verify that materials are, for example, the components of the structures are strong enough, the systems, and in welding and in other areas too, and without causing any damage, and then they can use it. So from my conversations with CQI and with Jason, this is really innovative and something that the college would really do well. And the job market is excellent in this field. The actual location, I'm thinking it's in aviation. I don't have that concrete information, but I think if Jason, once he joins us, can explain. But I hope that gives you some background information.
Well, I just want you to know that I used to do that type of testing.
Really?
It has to be very remote. The methods analysis that is done is not something, everybody has their own standards. And as far as soldering is concerned, they use laser technology in order to determine, the fit of a good solder joint. It's not, I don't see the college, in my view, from what I know in industry, I don't see the college being able to adequately do that type of a function. I'd have to have more information.
Chancellor Lambert, is your additional staff available to talk on this item?
Unfortunately, I cannot see who's on. So unless Jason is on, I don't believe we have someone who can speak directly to the actual pieces that Ms. Garcia is speaking about.
Chancellor, I'm looking at the list of names and I don't see him, but I know that he was available and was going to be joining. So I can reach out again and see if he can join us in as soon as possible.
Okay, so why don't we table this item? Why don't we just we'll put this. We have an active motion. So if there's a Mr. Sylvan, correct me if I'm wrong, if through just sort of a unanimous consent, we can just move this item to the end of the agenda, or at least to the third action item. Is that okay?
Yeah, from a procedural standpoint, yes.
Okay, terrific. So we'll go ahead and address this hopefully once he is on. The next item is 2.2, our intergovernmental agreement with Arizona Governor's Office of Highway Safety for DUI impaired driving enforcement overtime grant program. Mr. Sylvan, if you could read the recommendation.
Oh, and if I might, just for context, so normally we don't have action items at a study session, but in this case, these were all items that college staff wanted to be able to work on and have available to for the starting in January or the spring semester. And because the board didn't have a regular meeting until January, that wasn't going to be soon enough to allow the preparations, assuming that the board approves. So with that, the Chancellor requests the governing board authorize the Chancellor or designee to execute an intergovernmental agreement with the Arizona Governor's Office of Highway Safety to implement the DUI Impaired Driving Enforcement Grant Program. The grant performance period is from September 15, 2021 through September 30th, 2022, with the award amount of $20,000.
Do I have a motion to approve the recommendation?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, sounds like it was seconded by Ms. Ripley. Discussion. Chancellor Lambert, is there any additional details that we need on this item?
I don't think there's additional details that you need. If you have any questions, we'll be glad to answer them.
Are there any questions from the members of the board? Okay, I don't hear any. Hearing none, all in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
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 Anyone opposed? Okay, hearing none, the motion passes unanimously. Our next item is 2.3, our intergovernmental agreement with Arizona Governor's Office of Highway Safety for pedestrian and bicycle enforcement grant program. Mr. Sylvan, if you could please read the recommendation.
The Chancellor recommends the governing board authorize the Chancellor or designee to execute an intergovernmental agreement with the Arizona Governor's Office of Highway Safety to implement the pedestrian and bicycle enforcement grant program. The grant performance period is from September 15, 2021 through September 30, 2022, with the award amount of $8,000.
Do I have a motion to adopt the recommendation?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second from Ms. Ripley. Are there any questions or concerns from the board? Okay, hearing none, all in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
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 Dr. Hay?
I said aye.
We didn't hear you. Thank you.
Sorry.
Anyone opposed? Okay, hearing none, the motion passes unanimously. Chancellor Lambert, do you have the staff on for the 2.1 certificate?
I do not see Jason on.
Okay, so let's go ahead and start the fiscal year 2023 budget overview. Well, I guess the question is to the board, what do we want to do? Do we want to wait for additional discussion from staff?
I would think Chancellor Lambert, I mean, do you think your staff is able to pull this off? I mean, is there any real issues?
I don't think the staff would have brought this forward if they did not believe that they could pull this off and provide this opportunity for our students.
Right.
That would be correct. And it's part of the American Society of Non-Destructive Testing also. And we know that Jason and his team are very thorough in looking at what is possible. And so Jason, I just found out is unable to join us. And Greg Wilson is on annual leave today. So I'm trying to get somebody else.
Well, I'm comfortable voting on it, Damien, if you're
Okay.
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we have a motion on the table, so why don't we vote? And if the motion fails, we can always bring back the item. So is all in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
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 Anyone opposed?
No.
No. Okay, the motion passes 3-1 with Ms. Garcia dissenting. Our next item is our item 3, our fiscal year 2023 budget overview and discussion. Chancellor Lambert.
Yes, Mr. Chair, we're excited to be able to provide a budget overview and discussion with the board and to really get some of your thoughts and perspectives as we start to get heavily into the budget development process. As you'll see, there's a number of important items that Dr. David B. will go through this afternoon. So with that, Dave, I'll turn it over to you.
Chairperson Klinko, members of the board, Chancellor Lambert, colleagues and guests, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be with you talking about the budget at a relatively early stage in the process. Just to give a very high level overview, that we're going to walk through some figures, give you some preliminary estimates. And this session really is an opportunity for you to give your feedback on information you'd like to see as we go into the budget development cycle, additional information you'd like to see, conversations you'd like to have with us related to the upcoming budget, and then give us some preliminary feedback if you have any related to some of the typical key items, the key items being tuition, salaries, compensation, benefits, as well as property taxes. And those are sort of the big items that we'll talk about that we always like to get the feedback. And then lastly, what priorities the board may have in addition to the priorities that are spelled out in the strategic plan, the chancellor's goals, some of the information that we presented with the Prop 481, where we spelled out what our priorities are going forward. Those are the things we're trying to fold into the budget and increase the funding for. But this is also the opportunity for the board to give their feedback and give, if they want to talk about different priorities to also try and fold into the budget, this is one of the opportunities to do so. So as I mentioned, I'll start with an overview.
And Dr. B, I'm sorry, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to note for the record that Mr. Gonzalez has joined us.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
So we'll talk a little bit about enrollment, which is the biggest challenge the college has right now. Talk a little bit about our estimates for the key revenue sources. Again, our expenditure priorities, I'll go through a few of them. And then as have come up in a number of conversations in the course of the last budget development, and then from then till now, conversations about positions that we have at the college, positions in relationship to the enrollment figures, and then give you a little bit of a primer on compensation, as probably the biggest priority from an expenditure standpoint this upcoming year is going to be the outcomes of the class comp study and how we prioritize and fold that into the budget. So those are some of the key things that we're going to be talking about. And again, this is an opportunity for you to give us feedback. Again, the budget gets developed through a series of conversations, starting now all the way through primarily May, and then adoption happens in June. And we put the budget calendar at the end, a link to that for your reference. So as I mentioned, the biggest challenge the college is facing at this point is without question our enrollment. Our enrollment peaked back in 2011. That was in the middle of the fiscal crisis, and it peaked at just under 23,000. This shows the last 10 years and shows how it declined following that fiscal crisis and sort of the economic recovery. I think that was a more traditional way that community colleges are countercyclical, that as people had other opportunities other than college, they moved back into the workforce and our enrollment declined. It's stabilized around 2017, roughly, stayed within the same a relative range for that period of time until COVID hit. And then it took a big drop, as you all know. Just to put this in context, our enrollment is, again, it peaked at around 23,000, it was 22,900. So we're in the realm of about half of what we were when we peaked. And it is no question is the biggest concern we have, trying to get enrollment to bounce back. There are changes that have happened in terms of enrollment potential from fewer numbers of students coming through the high schools, et cetera. And then changes that have been happening that we've talked about with the board for a long period of time. A couple of other things that are worth mentioning when we look at this enrollment trend, because it also gets a little bit more complicated than this. When you're talking about, there are different changes in how our enrollment has adapted over the years. As you know, there's been a big increase in online instruction that was going on before COVID, and we expect to continue in a post-COVID, hopefully post-COVID world. So even if enrollments bounce back, the proportion of students who are taking online classes is likely to be higher than it had been. In addition to that, our two growth areas, so we've had growth in online instruction over the period of time that we're talking about, and we've had growth in dual enrollment. The other area that we've had recent growth in, and this is directly, I think, a function of board action, is in the student success courses. So that is another area of growth. So that's positive that those areas are growing. The downside to it is that they have other implications. So dual enrollment and student success courses, we don't generate revenue from those. Dual enrollment offsets the instructional costs, and so it's essentially a wash with the high schools who participate in dual enrollment. And then with the student success courses, since we now no longer charge tuition for that, we are not generating any revenue from those courses. That said, those courses we've all decided, I think, and there's a lot of good evidence to support that really does help student success at the college. And I will be interested in hearing board support or not for that, but I'm expecting that we will take that as a proposal to continue the providing student success courses at no tuition going forward. Why I'm mentioning those things is that all of those have different impacts in terms of what does that mean to revenue, and then with online enrollment growing and dual enrollment being the growth areas, it is having an impact in terms of our on-site enrollment. So the number of students who are actually on campus who are doing things like buying books at the bookstore or buying food at the food service operations are dramatically lower than they used to be. And we have a new reality in terms of our infrastructure at the different locations that we have in terms of the number of students who are actually on site. That's going to be an ongoing conversation that we have with you. In terms of the revenue picture going forward, so this is a good news, challenging news kind of year. The good news is that we have some additional revenues coming in. Firstly, property tax, we're estimating that there will be growth in new property, so we don't have to do anything to get that additional amount. That's about probably 1.3 million. It could be a little bit higher than that. So that's just new properties that come onto the tax rolls. We charge the tax rate, and then we get all that additional revenue. The college doesn't have to do anything. That's just support for providing service to more people and more properties in the county. The last couple of years, we have not increased our tax levy at the board authorized to. You can increase it by 2% every year. The college maintains the ability to levy up to that maximum amount. So if you forego it, the first 2%, the first year you don't do that. The next year you can recapture that 2% that you didn't do, and so on for each year that you don't levy at the max. So we've done 2 years of that now, and so we have additional tax capacity that is in the neighborhood of 7.5 million. So in order to tap into that tax base, we do have to do a truth in taxation process. It's no different than the usual process that results in the 2%. But the difference is that instead of being a 2% increase, as we used to be customary, it would be closer to probably a 5 to 6% increase, which is far more noticeable to taxpayers and a little bit more noticeable, obviously, in their tax bills. That said, our tax levy is spread pretty significantly throughout Pima County. There are lots of taxpayers. And so the typical taxpayer in Pima County, residential taxpayer, is paying the college in the neighborhood of, it's actually a little bit less than $200 a year. So when you increase by, so every $200, a 5% increase to that would be an increase of $10. Just to give you some context. So it's not a huge increase to the typical residential property. Nevertheless, we're at a point where it's difficult for folks to balance their budgets, and there may be some resistance to increasing taxes by that amount. So we have the capacity. The really good news on that is that because 481 passed, we have the ability to use all of the additional taxes for operational purposes. So that is real money that can help us with our operational budget. The downside to that is that with a number of metrics that we track, and we have them on the website, we have some links to them at the back of this presentation, is that we have metrics where It's the proportion of the operations that are funded by tuition versus property taxes, and that is getting misaligned. So there are two key things that are getting misaligned right now. Anything related to the expenses or the staff per footsie is misaligned because our enrollment has dropped so much. And then the other thing that's happening over time is because enrollment has dropped and tuition revenue has dropped in total, the share of the college's budget that's funded by property taxes is growing. That's also true because our other revenues have dropped because of COVID-related reasons. Other revenues, we used to have bookstore revenues, investment earnings, those kinds of things are negligible at this point. So it's really what used to be a three-legged stool that on certain years had good support from some of these ancillary sources is now really a two-legged stool that is disproportionately funded by taxes. That said, we can tap into that tax capacity a little bit more. Just for context, we did not do a tuition increase this last year. And with enrollment being where it's at, there are some arguments to be had for not increasing tuition. To give some context, because enrollment is down, the impact of increasing tuition is also lower because you have fewer credit hours being taken. So increasing by $1 now generates an additional $350,000. So $3 in tuition increase would generate about an additional $1 million, just for some keeping that in the back of your mind. And then the last piece of good news is the Prop 207. That's the Smart and Safe Arizona legalization of marijuana, where the community colleges get some proportion of the tax-based revenue from that. We've gotten our first distribution. We're still waiting to get a good estimate for what next year is going to be. I would say it's safe to say it's going to be an additional $5 million, and hopefully it'll be closer to what the early projections are, which will be closer to $10 million. So as we get into the beginning of the spring, we'll give you updates on what that really looks like, because we're getting distributions twice a year. So we've gotten one that was really early, and we're waiting to get a good idea of what the growth is to project out for next year. So that's additional revenue. It does have restrictions on it that is to be used for workforce type training, but the college provides a lot of workforce type training. So that would essentially go in to help us with those operational areas and still maintain true to that, to the 207 purpose. So total, you're talking about increased revenue capacity here. Say we don't do tuition increase, you're probably talking about an additional capacity of maybe $12 million of additional revenue. So that's good news. The bad news is that tuition is down because of enrollment close to about $10 million versus what it was like pre-COVID time. So what has happened is we've had the federal funds that have stabilized us and basically provided that cushion, that it avoided that. We were able to use the money for the loss in revenue. That's going to go away next year. So while we have these additional revenues and it's probably a net positive, it isn't as net positive as it sounds like. And that's just something that we're going to have to think about as we go forward. Okay, here's some charts, and we can shoot through some of these fairly quickly. They're just to show you how things look over time. This is our operating budget as for the last 10 years, and then in comparison to the enrollment. So as I mentioned, we have a lot of metrics that compare how our expenditures, how our staffing levels are compared to our enrollment levels. And we did quite well when we were doing the budget reductions. That's this period of time here where we were reducing our costs in light of the expenditure limitation future that we were foreseeing. Prop 481 passed, and then that last year, because we had in the fiscal year 21, actually it was in 20 that this happened, that we had realized what our objective was to get down to the expenditure limit level we wanted to get down to, and then we reinvested for that period of time. So that's why that year you see a little bit of a bump, and then last year when 481 passed, we also increased some expenses, salaries and other expenses that were related to COVID support, et cetera. And I see that there is a question.
Sorry, quick, you answered that at the end, Dave. Just the increase was due to salary increases, partly?
salary and COVID-related investments, as well as and I have another slide. This one actually shows it a little bit more clearly. This is the context, the historical context, where it shows the things that the college, this is sort of going back in time and saying when the challenges really started. Back in 2009, when the first state aid cuts happened, I mentioned the enrollment peak. Back in 2011, state aid was completely eliminated in 2015. You can see where we were reducing expenses here in the 2017, 18, 19. We did a really good job of that. That's reducing a number of positions, et cetera. And then starting in 20, we did some reinvestment because we had capacity with EL for some of those enrollment-based initiatives, and then COVID hit. And then on top of that, some of the investments that were related to the centers of excellence. So starting to put some equipment into the centers of excellence, some of the construction started. And these are actual expenses that we're looking at. And then the next year it was salary increases and then COVID response related expenses.
And I don't mean to belabor this, Dave, but just so I understand. So operational, I always think of as kind of salaries and fixed cost. You mentioned equipment and COVID. Are those one-time costs or you see those ongoing?
One time, these are mostly one-time costs, but some of them are operational. So license costs, adding additional laptops and things like that for a lending program for students. We use the federal funds to really ramp up that program. But if we sustain it, then they will be ongoing costs. A little bit lower than what the initial investment is, but there's going to be additional ongoing costs for some of those new technology costs. So there is an increase. It probably isn't as dramatic as what it looks like there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, expenditure priorities. Always, I would say that every year in the last number of years, personnel expenses have been our priority. It's the majority of our operational expenses. I already alluded to the fact that the outcomes of the class comp study, it is really hitting its stride right now, but there's a fair amount to go. So in the beginning of the spring, we'll be having a lot of conversations about what it truly looks like for the class comp study. The market study information, the preliminary information is back for faculty, and the market information is it's pretty close. Most positions are pretty close to the market-based rate. And then staff is still underway. We have not seen that same information, but we should see it pretty soon. Then what happens is then we talk about what should the structures look like. We have groups working on that, and I have some information later on to talk a little bit about what does it look like and where are the concerns from my perspective for class comp. But that what we do know is that it will be an additional cost. Because we know that some positions are out of range with market comparisons. We have positions that have stagnated at the low ends of the salary scale. So if there are significant adjustments to some salary scales, that there will be adjustments there. And we've made a clear commitment to staff that even if a position is identified as being above where it should be paid in the new structure, that we're not going to reduce pay as a result of this class comp study. So there will be additional expenses associated with class comp. People will not lose money as a result of it. Individuals will not lose money as a result of it. In addition, adjunct faculty are working, there's a group working on a different compensation structure or exploring the idea of a tiered compensation structure. So adjunct faculty who maybe have more experience at the college, have done professional development training, are experienced, might have a higher per load hour rate than the newer adjunct faculty. So we're exploring the possibilities with that, and we'll come back to the board with those different suggestions or recommendations or ideas coming out of those groups as the budget comes forward. We have to look at our contractual obligations. We have some good news in this area. Medical, we haven't had huge losses. We don't have a good firm number on the actuarial analysis for the upcoming year. We'll know more about that in January, and we'll be relaying that information to the board as we have more of these conversations. The good news is on the state retirement system is actually the rates for next year are going to go down just a tiny bit. So it's not going to have a huge impact. It won't relieve a lot of pressure, but it beats the alternative where the rates go up and we have to find that money. And then moving forward, and this IT infrastructure is actually probably should be in the strategic initiative section. I mentioned the student device initiative, looking at what we can do to provide those kinds of support to students, both to have resources available for students to be successful, but also to push the digital literacy and fluency initiatives that the college is really working on, trying to integrate the use of technology in every classroom, and the student walks in that they're using technology that will be integrated with their academic program. So we'll be talking more about that, with the board about that in the upcoming months. And then I talked a little bit the strategic plan, development of centers of excellence. There are some additional faculty needs in some of the centers that as aviation ramps up, there are going to be additional positions. We've started ramping that up, and we're looking for funding mechanisms and sources for that. But there will be some additional investments related to some of those programs. We're trying to minimize any additional costs related to staff positions, focusing more on trying to reallocate resources as much as possible. But it is hard when the skill sets that you don't need anymore might not align with the skill sets you need. So retraining, finding ways to move people into new jobs, but sometimes they're not aligned, and that's one of the challenges the college has. And then when we did 481, we talked about some of the priorities the college was moving forward. Most of them are related to strategic plan, getting the centers of excellence up and running. There are other priorities for student success and support. And there's a program going on with the child care, and ramping that kind of a program up would have potentially, it's initially grant funded, and it eventually may have some college costs associated with it. And then obviously enrollment and retention, and trying to focus on getting students to the college and ensuring that they're successful. Again, these are just some context slides, more for your reference, looking back in time, looking at how things have changed over time. And I mentioned that in the last couple of years, there's been a big increase in some of the institutional support type expenses. Much of that is related to one-time type expenses, or shifting toward technology related license costs, those kinds of things. There isn't a big increase. It's not because there's a lot of positions moving into administration. That's not what is causing the increase in the more recent increase. On the instructional side, it has stayed fairly stable in total expenditures over time. Largely, the instructional costs have been stable or going down because we're not offering as many classes. So it's a reduction in adjunct faculty costs, and it's a reduction in some full-time classes, because as full-time faculty have retired, we have the 50-to-1 ratio where we're not filling all of the vacant positions, and we're capturing that savings in the budget. And then if our enrollment turns back around, we'll start adding positions back in. And I have a slide that shows that. Here's a slide that shows how many sections we've been reducing over time. So you can see there's been a pretty significant reduction over time. Oh yes, board member Hay.
So, you mentioned the reduction in staff. I kind of think of, just-in-time hiring. It seems hard to do that in higher education. Enrollment's down, and so how much can we reduce workforce? And if enrollment comes back up, how much can we respond to that increased need? Because I see an opportunity here to rebalance the student enrollment to staff ratios, and increase the salaries to faculty, but I don't want to, cut off our hand to spite our face type of thing.
Yeah, and I think that when we get into the class comp study, or the class comp conversation, you get into there's hard to fill positions where the college has pockets of positions that are chronically hard to fill. And those can be, there are some in faculty, certain physics. Physics is one that I know of, adjunct faculty. Some of the occupational nursing obviously is another one. So some of those are really hard to fill, adjunct and full-time in some cases. Staff positions, information technology, and then there's some other positions that, because of the sort of post-COVID world, we're actually having some other challenges in hiring positions. So it's sort of pockets of where it's hard to fill, and that's why it's pretty clear with the class comp study. It's going to show that some of the market pay is a little out of whack, but it's going to be pocketed.
Chancellor, do you have a feel for that in terms of workforce? I mean, in terms of how we're staffed now and the chronic change in enrollment? If we need to act now, or we need to wait a year and see if the enrollment bounces back. What's your thoughts on that?
So I want to be careful in my choosing of my words. I would say that we are overstaffed, in some cases significantly, for the level of enrollments that we're at. Now, with that said, we know that the acute drop in enrollment is by and large due to COVID. So how much of that will recover as we come out of this, and how quickly, that's the question that remains on the table. And so I don't want to dramatically shift from a reduction standpoint if we start to see some level of recovery happening, and then we can't pivot because we've cut too much. You're going to see us adjusting in some level. I also think that we need to run different scenarios involving the campuses. Whether enrollments pick up or not, online has become obviously the modality of choice. So we're going to have to face the reality of how staffing is done at our satellite locations, and certainly have a number of ideas associated with that. So I think at this point, not making a major adjustment, but positioning ourselves to ease into an adjustment over a few years, similar to what we did coming into the pandemic, where we built 3 scenarios for the board. You chose a scenario, right, and then we started. So that's what you're going to see us do, is develop something similar to that, come back to the board, tell us which scenario to run with, and then we make adjustments accordingly.
Right. And Damon, I apologize but I guess it is a study session, so I can ask questions. And I do appreciate that supply and demand issue, and I applaud you for not being overcorrective on that. But it seems to me, though, your centers of excellence are primarily hands-on learning. It's not online learning how to fix a truck or a plane or put in a line, an IV line. That's hands-on, right? So that's not going to be online.
Well, but I think you're going to see those more and more be in that hybrid type of context, where the more didactic, more theoretical pieces can be done online, and allow us to potentially drive more in students on site, because we can offer more on-site time in the labs. So we're going to look at how we balance that. But part of our growth will come in those areas, and we're already seeing that now with automotive as it has come online. We've seen that with IT, cyber, since that center is opened up, that our enrollments are growing in those areas. So, those are promising. But to your point, we'll be mindful of that mix. The reality, I think hybrid will be the modality of choice in the long run. And then you'll have on one end of the spectrum, the purely face-to-face, and then on the other end of the spectrum, the purely online. But I think hybrid over time will be the prevailing model.
Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Garcia. You're not.
Meredith, thanks for those thoughts. And Chancellor, I agree with you that it's probably going to be a hybrid. But I want to interject something here that I've looked at, and that is that not necessarily cutting some of the faculty. It's important that we look at everything. But one of the things that strikes out to me is the director ratio compared to the students. In 2012, it was one director per 881 students. We are now at 244. And administration, the ratio was, let me see, directors. And for administration, it was 400 in 2012 for one student, per administrator, and now it's 244. So I would ask that we please look at that. I think that we have way too many directors and too many administrators. And I know that some of the pay levels for the administrators, they were directors and were just moved over. So before we start on faculty, I think we need to look at the upper level as well. So
Board Member Garcia, it's great that you're looking at those ratios. I appreciate that, but I think it's more nuanced than what you're presenting. So I'll give you an example. We run a systems model at Pima. Unfortunately, the state does not have a systems, so we have to staff for some positions that in other states would be absorbed at the state level. So I'll give you an example, and not to pick on Jeff, but in my former state, we didn't have our own college attorneys. We used the Attorney General's office because of the nature of the model. Also, for all of the classified staff, we had a State Department of Personnel that was also integral to how we manage some of those HR functions. We don't have that in the state of Arizona. So we have to account for a lot of that at the local level. So that's why it's hard to just tie everything to the student ratio. Because whether you have 1,000 to 1 or 100 to 1, there's some things we've got to have in order to make sure we're in compliance, et cetera, at the college. So I just caution us there. So with that said, and I think this gets lost, when we were adjusting a few years back, we started eliminating administrator positions first. So administration took some of the largest cuts at the college. So as we moved deeper into the process, that's when you saw us adjusting the other categories of employees. I hate to say it's not easy, but if you look at ratio of student to employee, where that ratio is going to be the clearest is faculty to student. Then the further you move away from that, that's where it gets a little more challenging. So I just don't want us to lose sight of those nuances as we look at rebalancing the pie. One of the key considerations is locations. Obviously, if you have a less location, you need less staff. And so that is why you're going to see us even get more, put more emphasis on what that ratio should look like at the staffing of the satellite campuses.
And I agree with that, Chancellor, with the staffing levels of the campuses, because, and it is just my view, and I don't understand it thoroughly, but I can tell you that having a vice president for every campus is totally wrong. Not for the amount of students that are there. We didn't have that before. I just don't think that we're managing things as efficiently as we should.
Well, Ms. Garcia, I would, and Chancellor Lambert, I would just, push back a little on that, because there has been a significant redesign over the last number of years. There was originally a very different type of structural model, and over time that model has evolved. And instead of having higher paid individuals in charge of the campuses, this was a strategy that was employed to create more, I think, two things. One, a more direct student service approach. So it was one person really being able to focus on the issues there. And two, it was, I think, right sizing and addressing some of the resource challenges that we have. And I'll let Chancellor Lambert address that further.
So thank you, Chairman. So when I first arrived, we had 6 campuses with 6 presidents, with multiple vice presidents and deans at each of those locations. That is no longer the model. We don't have 6 presidents. We don't have multiple vice presidents at each of the locations. So we've really tightened that up. Also, when you compare us to other districts, and I'm not sure if Dave's sharing that data tonight, but we're not inconsistent with what you see nationally. So we're very mindful about our non-instructional staffing levels, especially at the management and administration level. But keep in mind, as long as we are a college, these duties have to be performed by somebody. And then those somebodies have to have the skills to do the work. So we can't just take anybody and put them in a role. So that also is another variable in this. But I will let you know, some of our administrators, because of the success of the district, I know you may disagree with me, Board Member Garcia, we are becoming an attractive place for other districts to try to poach our talent. In one case, I'm not going to cite you the position, a very equivalent position that we have at the college, where we're probably paying about $120, $130, they're paying like $180 for. So there's a reality in the market that if we want solid talent at the college, we're going to have to pay for that talent. Now, yes, we can get people to fill the seat, but are you going to get the skilled people who are driving the level of success that we're seeing at Pima? And I would argue that we would not. So there are some realities that we're going to have to continue to face, and we've been facing them. That's the great news about Pima. We've been managing our financials in a very responsible way. That's why coming into the pandemic, we were not doing what other colleges and universities were doing, laying people off or furloughing people, because we were very much managing the situation very well. But we're now at that next level of evolution, and we need to keep adjusting accordingly.
Well, I'm just asking that you look at everything.
Everything's always on the table.
And as far as the different pay scales and stuff, it'd be interesting to see what the pay scales really are for your administrators and your directors.
That's why we're doing the class comp.
Okay, thank you.
Board Member Ripley.
I think the chancellor answered my question. I guess this is why this is a study session. All questions are appreciated. Yeah, I mean, when to say that the college is mismanaged, I guess there needs to be a greater detail and granularity on, you know, which administrators and which staff members would be considered non-essential then. And I guess this is why we must trust that this class comp is going to reveal a lot of the underpaid and the overpaid employees that we have, and then we can restart from there. But again, I'm glad you mentioned, Chancellor, because I was going to ask that question. Yeah, we have vice presidents at all 5 campuses, but my question was, didn't we used to have 5 or 6 presidents and 6 vice presidents? So now we have 5 vice presidents and 1 president. Is that correct?
So in terms of campus VPs, that's correct. We have more VPs, but in terms of the campuses and how they're overseen by these campus VPs, and as opposed to campus presidents. Hopefully that answers your question.
See, and I'm sorry, but I understand that part of it, but the other part is the amount of students that are attending those campuses and the type of classes that are being given at those different campuses. They're not all the same.
Well,
Ms. Garcia, they require a different level.
Ms. Garcia, I would agree. I mean, I think at some point, you know, if we don't get a turnaround of this enrollment, we as a board and an institution have to look at the ability to maintain 5 independent campuses with the same level of service across the entire institution. I mean, I think that is a real reality. I mean, after we know that as people move online and after COVID, there's a greater interest in that modality. So there's going to be less and less individuals sitting in the classroom. And so I think as an institution, we're going to have to, again, relook at where and how, I mean, and we've already moved towards a concentrated model. I mean, we've had a lot of these important discussions over the last year and a half, a larger consolidation to the West Campus and the downtown campus, looking at alternatives for the administrative headquarters, looking at what are the things we can consolidate. But at some point, I mean, and I believe that as part of the long range deliverables that Chancellor Lambert has produced, so much has been about building partnerships so that we can even continue to utilize these campuses, but have less of maybe our educational footprint and more of a partnership capacity to enhance student experiences and success. And an example of that would be the cyber warfare range, where that's not our range, that's a partnership, you know, someone else running it, but they're in our space. So but I agree. I think that you're absolutely right. It's not just it's all of it together, and those campuses fundamentally represent jobs. Because if we end up winding down a campus, those individuals, you know, or those services become redundant. So, you know, I think it's a very complex sequence of events that are going to need to occur. But I'm really glad that we're really having this discussion now, because I think we have to be pragmatic about how much resources there are, what our needs are, what our student base is going to be, and how are we going to maintain the level of services and still run an institution. Ms. Ripley.
Hi, I mean, I just wanted for all those listening, because my learning curve has been huge these last 11 months. And one of the things I did, one skill set I did bring from my previous jobs, especially in the military, is that running a campus. So I taught as an adjunct, and I taught, 2, sometimes 4 times a week, but the campus is 24/7. So when you say, when we look at non-essential, employees, it's going to be very difficult because you have facilities and you have all of the people that run the libraries and you have the people that are, not just the operational people, but the maintenance people. So it's a lot to look at. And when you get down to, well, who can we cut? It becomes really difficult. Like, what is the minimum amount of people to run actually all of these buildings in 5 campuses? And personally, I think that the board will try as hard as we can to keep these campuses. It would be a shame to have to close one down before we have all of the information and act, like David said, too hastily because of COVID, because we're still in it. So I think all of these decisions we make have to be very carefully done. And that's why we're having this study session. So thanks everybody for all of the input. So this is why we're here, is to talk it out.
No, I thank you, Board Member Ripley, and thank you, Board Member Garcia, as well, and all of you, because this is, remember, there's our enrollment present day, and then we're trying to project out into the future, 3 to 5 years, what the landscape's going to look like, and then do we have the infrastructure to respond? We also have to face another reality that's unfolding not just in our community, but across the country, and that's the SANSdemic. And that SANSdemic is that there's just going to be less people in the United States. Less, the fertility rates have been dropping since the 70s. They're getting even more accelerating as we have learned recently because of the pandemic. People have had less babies over the last couple of years. So you can just forward that out, 18 years, right, from 2020, and we're going to be in a constant roller coaster, I think, as a country and as a community. And some are already arguing that, even if you increased immigration, that's not going to solve your demographic challenges. All of that is what we look at Pima, trying to balance the pie out. I think we've done a pretty good job up till now doing that. I just, as to your point, Board Member Ripley, I don't want us to jump too quickly. That's why we're going to bring you a plan, just like we did the last iteration. We brought a 3-year plan and then moved to that place, and that's where we are right now. We'll do the same thing, and that plan will factor in the potential, like we did last plan. We took a campus offline last plan, that we would build in potentially that same kind of scenario again going forward. But also, all of you have had a chance, other than you've not had the everyone has visited Gateway in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And if you recall, visiting some of their facilities, they weren't well staffed. And so that, I think, offers a model for us to think about. You can have the facilities, but you can size down your level of staffing at your locations. But remember, when we went to the Auto Center, and the faculty member who some of you spoke with, he came in the morning, he came back in the afternoon, and he came in the evening. And so there's some inherent realities that we need to think about there in terms of how we look at things going forward. Also, Dolores and I visited the Georgetown campus in Seattle. It's a campus part of the Seattle district. And it was a campus completely focused on building construction technology. I believe they told us they had less than 40 people on staff at that location. And it was a location probably the size of our East Campus. So it shows me, at least, that you can maintain a location with a minimal amount of staff. And so those are the things we'll take into consideration. But this feedback is very helpful, but I don't want us to lose sight of those larger realities that are unfolding.
I'll add a couple of pieces related to questions that were raised. In terms of management positions, so we have looked at IPEDS data, so that's a national data set where we can pull our peer institutions and do comparisons of the number of faculty, staff, total positions versus enrollment. And where we are doing okay is actually in the faculty side, which I'll explain in a second, but that's related to the fact that we've reduced positions over time through that model, through retirements. And then actually in management is the other one that we're actually pretty much on the trend line with our peer institutions in terms of the total number of management positions. Management positions in IPEDS is different from the Pima definition. It is not the definition that is administrators. It's roughly administrators plus directors. And then it hits a couple of other positions, but mostly it's those positions. And even though those totals have grown a little bit in recent years, we are actually about on where the average would be for our peer institutions. So we're not out of whack with management positions. Where we are high is in staff positions. And I think that that gets back to what we're talking about, which is the inefficiency of having so many locations, particularly in comparison to our enrollment now, is where we're sort of inefficiently structured. A couple of other points. With the campus administrative positions, there is a matrix model. And so those campus vice presidents aren't just sitting there at that campus. They have other responsibilities and crossover around the district that they're responsible for managing and maintaining as well. So if you were to reduce that position, you still have a fair amount of responsibility that's going to have to go to another position. And then the other thing is that our director positions have grown for a couple of reasons. One is because we've increased the number of student support functions. The counselor positions moved into the staff side. We bumped up some of the student support areas in general. And then the other thing that has happened is we've also added a number of positions that are academic directors. So they're hybrid. They do a little bit of teaching and they're responsible for the academic programming for certain programs. And so they're directors, but they're not directors in the institutional support administration kind of way. They're actually doing things that are directly connected to the academic programs. And that's where some of the growth has also come from. So we do monitor these things. We look at it and we'll share a little bit more of that information in comparison to our peer institutions. Because when you think about it, is actually showing us what we think is kind of the case. We've done a lot to make the administration lean at the college over the years, and that we're sort of conscientious about that. But there's a certain point at which the functions have to happen. It's sort of a fixed expense, if you will, and that's where the next slide actually sort of shows that the administrative functions, if we don't reduce significantly in terms of the total number of facilities that we have, and we have this spread out structure, and we have a lot of staff, that there's by nature then going to be a higher level of management and administration related to it. And as Chancellor Lambert mentioned, we are a standalone district and we don't have anything being performed by the state level. And there are some states or some community colleges where the information technology system is managed statewide, so that you don't have a number of the positions that we have on staff. Some systems have benefits administration are handling at the state level. In fact, the university is the Board of Regents works that way, where they have a shared health plan. So there are things that we have to do structurally that make us look inefficient versus some other states, and that's just something to be aware of. So what you can see is over time, we have kept the number of administrative services. Those are positions that are institutional support and plant and auxiliary. Those are the categories that we're counting in that. They've reduced a little bit over time, and then held fairly stable. I think, again, you could say that there's some fixed qualities to those positions unless there's some big substantive changes at the institution. And then where some of the reductions have happened is mostly in the academic support side and the instruction side, where we've reduced positions, again, because there are fewer students and there's fewer direct demand for those positions. This is the model that I talked about, the 50-to-1 model. So this is the full-time instructors versus the full-time students. And we set this model in place around 2016, where we looked at it and we measured it based on other peer institutions. And then also we didn't just look at that, because again, sometimes our peer institutions do things that are different from what we do. We looked at it, got a measure. There was a trend where they were around 50-1. And then we looked at it, does that still make sense with the college? And going back in time, it actually made sense where we hit the number pretty much spot on in 2014. So there was a time where it made sense for the college. So what we've been trying to do over time is sort of target, here's the number of positions that, with our enrollment being where it's at, here's the number of full-time faculty positions, and then through retirements, trying to reduce those down to hit that measure. As you can see in this chart, we've never hit it. We came close in 2020. But now with enrollment being significantly down, we're again out of whack with that measure. We're not looking to reduce a lot right now because, again, there might be a bounce back effect. We know that there are some additional faculty needs in some hard to fill areas. So it's trying to adapt to that reality. But based on that measure in the new enrollment realm, even faculty are now a little bit out of whack as well. Okay, so that sort of summarizes the position information, and we'll show you some of the more intense data looking at the IPEDS comparison institutions. We'll show you some of that in the future. I want to do a sort of a quick primer in class comp, just so that because that's going to be a really big part of the conversation with the board in the upcoming 6 months. So currently we have a structure that is sort of a typical public entity type model where we have grades. So a position gets identified as being a certain grade, and then there are different steps associated with that. Those steps are different for different employee groups. So our non-exempt and exempt staff steps are 2.5%. So that the value of step 1 times 2.5% is an increase. That's what a step is worth. For faculty, it's actually a flat dollar amount. So for the lower level faculty positions, it's considerably higher proportionally. It's about 5%. And then the higher level positions, the doctorate level positions, step 15 to 16 is more like a 2% increase. It's a little bit higher than 2%. So it varies because it's a flat dollar amount that's equal for each step for all of the faculty positions. So it is different when you say that we want to give step increases.
Dr. B, Ms. Garcia has
yes.
a question.
Okay. Oh, yep.
It was my understanding that you guys aren't implementing any steps. Is that true? You're not using the step
not
process.
exactly. Well, people are on steps right now. So when that's being said, what it means is that years ago, the college had, well, there were 2 different mechanisms. Let's go with a long time ago, so about 20 years ago, when this grade structure was set in place, steps were granted when the college had money for those who had been there for a year. So it was a longevity-based step increase.
I see.
Then around 16 years ago, the STEP program shifted to be something where you had to do additional work to get a STEP increase. And that varied for the different employee types. So with administrators, there was a plan that you had to put together. Same with exempts, there was a plan. There was some professional development. There were certain goals that you had to hit for what your personal goals were as an administrator. Non-exempt, it was very heavily related to the number of hours of work and professional development they did, and also there were some volunteering components to it. And then faculty, it had to do with, are they meeting their requirements in terms of being on committees, et cetera. It was very different in terms of the success rate for individuals to attain a step during the course of the year. The non-exempt folks tended to, I think it was more like 30%, something like that, would get them in a given year, versus closer to probably 90% for faculty. So it was a big range in terms of how many people earned a step by doing the step plan. And then the costs associated with it, again, were different. And so what we were doing back there, the college would give the same pool increases to each employee group, And then from that pool, what would happen is if it was big enough to also give a step increase. So I said for staff, it was a 2.5%. So if the college gave a 3% increase, we would take the amount necessary for those who earned a step, take that out of that 3%, and then lift the scales up for everybody. And so there's a calculation that happens. Where it becomes challenging is when you can't give an increase that is for the faculty to give all faculty who are earning them a step was something closer to 3.3%. And if you're not able to give salary pool increases that are 3.3%, then you can't do steps. And that was one of the things. So it was not equitable in terms of how people were getting them. It created other problems. And then we were going through the financial challenges where we weren't able to give pool increases sufficient enough to give step increases each year. So there were a lot of factors that led to the board deciding to suspend the STEP program. And that was about 8 years ago, which is still being mentioned now. And the consequences of that are actually shown in the next slide, which is this shows where, and people ask like what, I've said that there are significant problems with our class comp structure right now with the way that it has played out since it was done 20 plus years ago. What has happened is that normally with a class comp structure, people might be hired at the minimum of grade, but then as their skills improve and their knowledge of the institution and their knowledge of their jobs improve, they often move up towards the midpoint where it's sort of an average that they're a performing person who knows their job well. That's the way it's done in some institutions or some organizations. What has happened over time here is because we haven't been increasing for steps, because we haven't had the money to do it, and because of what I said, that there was it was disproportionately difficult for some employee groups to get steps. What you have is a real big disconnect, particularly on the staff and administrator side, where a lot of, you can see in here, this is the percentage of our employees who are at step 1 by employee type. And so where it's really bad is about 65% of our non-exempt staff are at step 1. So they're all making the same amount of money, no matter that they've been here for 5 years or 1 year. And they're all clustered in that level. Exempts are also not great. They're at about 45%, and then administrators are at about 25%. Faculty have a mechanism where it's based on, they either are placed after they come into the institution, they're placed based on their years of experience teaching. So depending on how many years of experience they have when they come to the college, they can be placed as high as step 6. And then based on the years of experience they get, they can move up to step 6. After that, it would be based on those steps, the step program that I was referencing. But faculty, it's different than the way the staff works, because for every couple of years of experience they get, if they would be placed higher if they had gotten that experience outside of Pima, they get moved up through an administrative process that happens every year now. So that's why you see for faculty, the highest percentage are at step 6, because again, if they came in at step 3, they would have, over the last few years, would have still moved up a little bit and would move, and that's why most of them are at step 6, and then there's some who are above that. And so when you ask me, one of the things that's really out of whack is actually how people are located with their scales. Now, there's also an important thing to understand about that. That doesn't mean that people are not paid. If you're at step 1, that doesn't mean that you're not paid a market wage, because what has happened is we've also lifted our scales. And so step 1 for us might actually be the midpoint for someone else's scale. And so that's one of the things the class comp is going to take a look at and say, well, we want to move people up. We want to have people move up within their grades to a midpoint level or something like that. That's a typical way to look at class comp. But that what might be the case is people who are at step 1 might actually be at step 4 in the new scale. So it might not result in, they might be on step 4, but that scale might be lower and they might not be making more money. Now, that said, we have made a commitment that we're not going to reduce anyone's pay in that situation. So it's not like someone moves over, they're on the equivalent of, they're at step 1 now, that they're now going to be at they would be at step 4. We're not going to reduce them down to step 1, or we're not going to cut their pay if they're already above the point at which they should be based on the analysis. Hopefully, I know that's a lot that I just threw out. Again, we'll be explaining more of this as the class comp study information comes in, but I wanted to show you just some of the key things that are misaligned with our current class comp structure, just because it's been around for so long and sort of has degraded in its effectiveness. And again, as I mentioned, one of the other things that we see is that there are certain hard to fill positions where the labor market is showing us that we're not able to pay people appropriately for the skill set we need, and we don't have people applying for the job. So that's another mechanism that tells you you're not paying enough and people don't apply for the job because they have other opportunities. And think, you know, the easy one to think about is information technology, right? They're highly in demand, they're paid very well, and they're sought after all through town. So it's hard to, so their market-based pay has gone up pretty significantly over the years. There are some mechanisms where people are getting adjustments, though, to get back to Board Member Garcia's question. I mentioned the faculty one where they are lifted up to that step 6. There are also in-range adjustments where if someone has taken on significantly greater duties, but the job doesn't change, there can be an increase in steps to reflect the fact that their job just got far more complicated. At one point, we had a director in information technology who was just in the finance area, and then that position took over college-wide responsibilities and added a whole bunch of staff when that transition happened. And so that's the kind of thing where you go, okay, well, we need to make we need to make an adjustment to reflect the added complexities of that position. Those are relatively rare at this point, and mostly that's going to be addressed through class comp as we go through all of the positions. Individual position review is when someone is actually doing work that is totally different from what they were hired for. It happens occasionally, the job duties change, you have a really talented person, and an individual position review is where then it gets the information about what duties of the job the person does in their job gets submitted to HR and it gets evaluated. Again, we're sort of resetting all of those with class comp, but that was done sort of one-off. There was a cyclical process to do it every few years for lots of positions, but that it was more one-off when that happened. Now we're trying to reset that with class comp going forward. Faculty, the difference, again, there's a little bit of difference with faculty. I mentioned with the educational attainment. The other thing that's a little different with faculty is that their grade levels are determined by their educational attainment. So a faculty member who comes in with a master's degree and they get 18 more credit hours can move up to the next level, and they submit that. There's an ongoing process to do that so that they have some ability if they get their doctorate. They do have an ability on the annual to submit that information and get an increase in their pay related to that. That's not the way it works. Staff doesn't have that same kind of component as it's structured right now. And then the last thing with faculty, just to be aware that there is additional pay opportunities for faculty where they can take on supplemental assignments, teach extra classes, teach classes in the summer where they can add to their pay. So when you look at what the base pay is for faculty, that isn't consistent with what they actually make. Many of them make quite a bit more than that. Again, because they're working more. I'm not saying that it's for the same level of work. The base contract is for 169 days of accountability for teaching 10 courses, 10 3-load courses. If they teach more than that, then they get supplemental pay on top of that. And just to give you some context, it's the average amount of additional pay beyond the base level is close to $20,000. Again, for doing extra work, for taking on additional responsibilities. But the pay that you see on this table here, very few faculty actually make what's on the base contract amount of very few make just the base contract amount.
Dr. B.
Yeah.
Just for clarification's sake, and I mean, I know you don't have the data points in front of you, but I think I would certainly like to see if there was a way to create a visualization in a chart. You say the average is $20,000 additional dollars that on average, and all faculty are making, but it would be really nice to see how that is spread out numerically across the faculty.
Sure.
Like, is it being that there are people who are making 200 times, you know, in 20 faculty who are doing that, and, you know, 20 faculty who are not, you know, making very small. So it would be really nice to see, well, how does that actually play out? Because it's one of the things that I think we hear a lot of, and, you know, the base pay and how much people are actually taking home are different. So, and I would also be
we're
nice to
happy
really
to,
know
happy
what,
to show you that.
and I think it would also be nice as we sort of talk about this, is when you sort of show these charts, to really have a line item of what the average medical benefits are that the college is paying out. So we can really start to sort of all of the benefit lines. So we really can start to see what the costs really are in each of these areas.
And that's a great, thank you. You jumped right ahead of me. Total compensation is a key component. And one of the things that when, you know, I don't think that anyone would say that we have increased salaries and wages the way that we would prefer to over the last 10 plus years because of those financial challenges that I talked about. One thing that I think that we can be very proud of is that we've been very conscientious about keeping benefits strong, so that we didn't turn around and increase the cost, the premium cost to employees for the medical care, and, you know, and then give them a slightly higher, or, you know, basically cut that down so that they had to pay more in medical premiums, and then give them a salary increase that basically was used up to do that. We've been very conscientious about keeping the medical benefits, which is a huge outlay. You know, that is our biggest contractual obligation annually. And our retirement benefit is also a robust benefit that, just to give the board that hasn't been here quite as long as I have, when I came to the college, the contribution rates for employees and employer were about 3%. I just saw the number today. It is now 12% on each side. The college, over the course of time that I've been here, has had to absorb that additional cost for the college's share. From 3% to 12%. That's a significant increase in compensation in compensation expenses over time. And, you know, one that's great. It's really good for our employees, but it's not easy to do from a budgeting standpoint. We've also enhanced our short-term disability program, some other things to really provide robust support to our employees when they're in need. To have a seamless transition. If they have a short-term disability, have them be able to transition more easily from short-term disability to long-term disability. I think that we have a very robust benefits package, and that should be considered also when we're talking about compensation. And then this gets to the end of the conversation today. So next steps, again, this is a series of conversations and decisions that happen through the spring semester. We welcome feedback from the board, what your priorities are, again, particularly related to, you know, the class comp is going to be a big conversation, how we set up structures that meet the college's needs and also work better for our employees, make it that are understandable for employees. That's another key component to what we want to get out of the class comp work. And then, you know, tuition, those kinds of, what, you know, the interest in increasing the taxes on the community to help support the needs of the college. Those kinds of things are the things that we're really looking for some feedback from the board.
Board members? Well, I'll start off. I will say, you know, in addition to all of those things that you've outlined, which we're obviously going to, you know, whether or not we have direct direction this evening, or this is really the start of a conversation that I think, you know, again, we hope will be continuous for the next few months. I would really, again, like to see a very aggressive plan around student enrollment and what we can do to start ticking upwards. And I know we talk about this on sort of an annual basis and the faucets that we can turn on and turn off, but what are the more aggressive things and what is a real plan and the costs related to that we could really move the needle to get people back into the pipeline? Because it's, you know, it's not just about us, it's about the whole region, it's about the county, it's about those individuals who, you know, an entire cohort of people who are, you know, being forgotten or being left behind because of COVID, or, you know, are they finding alternative educational resources elsewhere because they had online options. I think maybe even better understanding the marketplace and again, understanding what's happening would be really useful for being able to make longer term decisions. So I think if we sort of wrap that into a budget priority that I'd like to see, and I'd like to see us be aggressive about that. Anybody? Ms. Garcia.
Well, I think also we need to look at the form in which we're providing the education. For example, like on your nursing, there was a company recently, one of the colleges, I think it was Grand Canyon, that is now offering shorter term nursing programs. So I think we need to really look at all that. How are we offering the courses? Can we shorten them? Does faculty have to be more accessible? I'm still, think that we have way too much space. I understand, and everybody keeps telling me, well, we need new space because it doesn't meet the criteria for the needs. I understand that, but then, so like I have put in a request before about how much lease space do we have? How much is vacant? How many, we're projecting. What is the percentage of people that are online? How well are the different campuses being utilized? We need to look at all that. So I would like to, have a session on those specific items. And then those board members who don't want to attend, well, they don't have to attend if they don't want to, but I need that.
So I guess I have two questions on that. One, and that is related to the budget, but, we did the educational and facilities master plan. We did an update. We have that product in terms of looking at sort of all of these different things around space utilization and how the spaces are being used and the percentages. Is there a way to do like a mini update to sort of better understand sort of in the COVID, as we move in or out of this COVID experience, where we are? Is there a way to sort of get that quickly or get an update that could help guide some of these discussions about where we're going? I'm just putting it out there, Chancellor Lambert. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. I hate to just sort of say, let's begin another thing. Right. And in a year, we're in a completely different environment, but is there a snapshot that we could get?
So different pieces to this. One is we're going to bring you the scenario of what should be our target for budget purposes. So we'll put that together. That helps us to then be able to say, in order to get to that number, these are the adjustments we believe we're going to have to make. Some of those fit right into what Board Member Garcia is talking about. So I don't want to put the cart before the horse, if you will. I want to know what is it that you want us to get to. Then we'll align things appropriate to that, as opposed to, oh, here's things we could do, but then that may not be aligned with what we think we ought to be headed as an institution. So another example of that is, as you're bringing up, Board Chair, is our enrollment plan, or what is the opportunity or what is not the opportunity, right? Because that will also drive some of these considerations. If we don't see, say, enrollment growth in our county for the next 5 years, well, that's going to be hard to try to increase enrollment in the way we're currently doing things. But that doesn't mean we can't get creative in some other areas that might yield some better outcomes. So I want to just be mindful of that. But we can certainly share, and I'd be glad to sit down with Board Member Garcia and take her through her questions and see if that gets at that as we're building this larger plan and emphasis. But it's whatever the pleasure of the board is, we'll meet it.
Ms. Ripley?
Oops. Hi, yes, thank you. So I think we've come full circle because I think Dr. B opened this session talking about enrollment trends and pointed out that enrollment is really what it all comes down to. And reading just every single day, there's an article in Higher Ed or any of the chronicles out there on education that talk about enrollment. So this is a nationwide trend, and it started even before COVID. Universities more so even than community colleges. So it's something that, I think I'm glad you started that out, this discussion, Dr. B, with enrollment, because it is something that needs to be on the front of our minds. And I know it is with the chancellor. I know it is with all of the board members. I think you talked about dual enrollment and student success courses, and you talked about the upshot and also the downsides. I mean, I think it actually is a net gain because it will lead to greater recruitment and retention. So you have to look at the ROI, the return on investments, and all of these. Everything from the centers of excellence, and every decision we make has to be couched with what's the return on investment. And not just to get through this next, we don't know how long COVID will last, but the post-COVID world when eventually things are going to die down. And again, hastily shutting down campuses and selling them, we can't get that back. So we might have to, who knows, but being hasty about it isn't going to help. So I love that we're starting this now, and we just need to continue. The talk about budget has to be ongoing every session, just about, because things are changing. So back to enrollment, more, it doesn't have to be dollar investment, but more time and more resources and people, as well as money, I think still needs to go towards student services and the recruiting, retention, and follow through, all the folks that are basically tasked for that, for enrollment, which includes marketing and communications and community outreach, reaching out to the high schools and the superintendents and the counselors. So all of that, again, it's going to take more people and resources, or maybe more efficient use of them. But again, the return on investment comes back to enrollment and therefore revenue. So everything we do needs to really keep that in mind as far as enrollment. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I saw Mr. Gonzalez took himself off mute, and now it looks like he's fallen off because I don't see him on the grid. So we'll give him a second to come back. One other thing I would say that Ms. Garcia, I think you had a really relevant point about the delivery of the educational services. And you sort of used the nursing as an example. I think we have to be, we really have to look and be very aggressive in delivering classes and programs to students when they need it, when they want it. And, I think we just have to, we talk about that. We talked about it. I think we've shifted a lot, but really better understanding the marketplace and how we can continue to especially serve those incumbent workers in the evening and ramp up programming that gets to that new demographic. If we know that it's not going to be the traditional student, how do we really begin to be aggressive? And I know there are models that we've looked at over the years across the country. Gateway is a great example. And I'd really like to see that begin to be implemented, and looking at what the cost to do some of that would be. Chancellor Lambert.
So I was going to add to all of that. It'd be great to hear your thoughts on tuition increases, levy increase. Should we, hold levy steady this year, especially in light of the rate of inflation? And should we also do the same for tuition, go another year for going that, or should we look at some scenarios in one or both of those categories?
For me, I think it's 100% tied to Ms. Ripley's point, to the ROI. If we are going to see investments that are, I think tuition that results, if the tuition increases are directly resulting in student experience and student success and student outcomes and the quality of the support services that we're able to provide, to me, that's not a concern as much as if we were doing it just to keep the status quo. It has to be, if we're going to be charging more, we have to provide more. And on the flip side, I think that if we don't start implementing levy increases, we're going to end up in a Pinal problem. Already we're starting to see that. We're building this. We're not actually, we did it 2 years, every year, this 2%, and sort of recognizing the economic uncertainty. We didn't, and now we've accumulated this tax levy. And again, it's a very small amount to the individual taxpayers on the bill, but it makes an enormous impact to the institution. And then again, how we use those funds, it really has to be justified. more than just backfilling because of down tuition. I mean, I really want to see a plan in place. Ms. Ripley?
Hi, yeah, I tend to agree, especially the discussion on tax levy, because last year we were in this state of really the unknown, and it was a scary time to be living. But now that we see that we don't know the end, but we're reaching sort of a steady state, which is the COVID world. But I think that the community at large just needs to be. We just need to address it and truly, in a fashion that we are all in this together. And when Dr. B pointed out, it's not for most people, a $10 increase isn't going to break or make anyone. So I think that since we didn't do it for the last 2 years, we really need to talk about, especially when it's going to make a big difference to us. And especially when you combine the 207 and the 481 and all of the other grants and scholarships that we're getting, I think, we're in a fairly good place, but it is still a little bit touch and go. And this is why these conversations are really important, so that we aren't nervous. So so already today, thank you, Dr. B, for showing a lot of this stuff, because already a little bit of my nervousness is dissipated because of the federal funding we got from HERF and from the federal, COVID funding. We were okay, but in the back of my mind as a board member is, what next? Now what do we do? So thank you.
And Mr. Gonzalez, I see you made it back to the meeting. Do you have thoughts on priorities?
Well, sorry, I lost audio. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. And I agree with what I heard, but I was gone for several minutes here. But I do realize that we need to come back and really look at the reference to the plan. I know that not knowing what's going to come again. As you know, there's another COVID strand coming up very quick. But I think we really need to look at all perspective, all options as well too, and really not only address it to the community at large, but really inform them of what the reality is and what the impact is, because those, as we've heard through the presentation here, comes back to what it is, the enrollment. But we need to share the not only address the stakeholders, but inform the stakeholders. That's what I'm trying to say, because the stakeholders do not know the insights in reference to what we've been looking at, of what's been there in the last 6-7 years as well too. But I think we need, my open opinion, it's only my opinion, I think we need to maintain what we did in the last 2 years and just keep it steady, because it's we don't know the unknown yet. But I think that's, maybe it'll change in 4 months, maybe it'll change in 6 months, I don't know. That's my opinion right now at this point.
Well, thank you very much for that. Are there any other thoughts from the board at this point? I mean, I think everybody can also reach out to Chancellor Lambert over the next month and, set up an individual meeting and, talk more in depth about, what everybody's thinking. I know I need a little bit of time to always digest Dr. B's robust presentations, but I really appreciate the depth and the clarity with which they're provided to help us make better and clear informed decisions. So thank you, Dr. B, for your presentation and continuing the dialogue. Are there any other thoughts? Okay.
Mr. Chair, let me just add just a few other points real quick. So as you know, we've been putting a lot of attention on enrollment. You saw the benefits of that pre-COVID as we had stabilized things. And then obviously COVID changed that mix. But the other thing that we have been doing is working on new types of programming. So we released in October Pima Fast Tracks. These are those short-term programs that you're referencing, Board Member Garcia. And right out of the gate, there was a lot of interest in these programs, so much so that we don't even have the capacity to meet the demand that they present for us. And then, so we're going to be doing more, and that we'll be doing them in the healthcare space as well, as you noted. But that's going to require potentially redirection of resources to really start to scale that. It represents new opportunity, but it also changes how you think about faculty load. That's why I'm bringing it up, because these are shorter term. They're not full semester long courses. And so how do we compensate faculty appropriately for the delivery of these shorter term courses? Those are some conversations we're going to have, but it does change the mix. But it also represents huge opportunity, just like the centers of excellence have also started to show promising signs. So the things that we've been doing are starting to work. We just need to give them the time for them. But it is changing the model that we have presently. And I just want you all to know that. And we're going to continue to work on that model. Doesn't mean we move away from degrees and longer term certificates. It means we add other pieces to the mix. But over time, the model is being transformed. Now the question is, what is that model going to look like as we go forward? And it's going to impact employees positively, and in some cases, not so positively.
But let's not also forget the liberal arts.
Yes, that's a big part of so Dolores. So thank you for bringing that up. So a lot of this stuff is also about the liberal arts. How do we make sure that they remain relevant? What we're learning from some other colleges is when you pair the liberal arts with some of these technical skills, they actually do better. But to just do the liberal arts by themselves, the data is not promising. So we need to start to make them more relevant, and that's what the provost is focused on doing. And so you'll see us starting to put greater attention in those areas as well.
I know I would certainly love to hear some of the thinking around that, on how we plan to help transform some of those degrees and those pathways into like the current skill sets that everybody needs for today's world. So I would really love to hear a really sort of comprehensive overview, and it doesn't have to be necessarily in a full study session, but I would certainly love to hear sort of what our thinking is in terms of what we're really going to do to really aggressively address some of this too, because I think we need to be transformational in some of these areas.
Oh, absolutely. We're going to go do some benchmarking of at least one university who's made some significant changes. We also talked to another college that made significant changes, and they're both showing promising signs. And a lot of it is tied to that digital literacy component that we've been in discussions about. I think it's now time to start to implement that. It does change how we might even look at how we charge students. By incorporating more digital tools into their hands, it does enhance the learning, especially in the liberal arts side. But the trade-off is maybe you're lowering book cost, and then I'm going to give you an iPad. Instead of charging you for books, I'll charge you for the iPad or a tablet device. And overall, your costs are lower because you're not spending all that money on textbooks. So we'll look at all of those variations, but we're trying to do that in a thoughtful way. But the liberal arts are a big part of it. That's what we've really got to put the attention on, because that's where our real opportunities are for enrollment.
Chancellor, I could add on right now if you like.
Sure,
Please.
and then Ms. Garcia.
Go ahead,
Okay.
Dolores.
Yes, thank you. So I just wanted to elaborate on what the Chancellor said. We've already started, in fact. So with our Bank of America initiative, there is a subgroup that's working with Dr. Mitchell and a lot of faculty and staff on looking at how we need to address the relevancy of liberal arts, enhancing it, because it is the foundation, it's the bread and butter of the institution. But how do we make it so students can get a job and know the technology, digital literacy? What are the 21st century skills? What are the learning styles? We learned from one of the universities that they focus their liberal arts on learning styles of each student, customizing that. We're also looking at DEI, incorporating that into the curriculum, not just having one officer working on DEI, but how is it included into the curriculum? So the work has already started. We have a task force, a subgroup, and so we'd be happy to give the board an update on that work.
Ms. Garcia.
Okay, so the other thing that I'd like people to consider is that some people are overpaid. I know people don't want to hear that. But as an example, we didn't vote for an increase for the chancellor, yet he still got one because the contract says 2% increase. I think that's rather unfair because there's a lot of other people that haven't. I think somebody sent me a text message about that between his salary and somebody else's, the lowest member, it's like 94% decrease, or, you know, I mean, I could send you the text message, but I really think that, you know, Chuck Huckleberry had to take a cut in pay. And I think people need to consider, and I would like the board to consider not giving additional increases to administrators or directors, at least for this coming year. Chairman, I would ask that, you know, we look at that as part of a consideration for our budget.
Well, I mean, so a few things. One, you know, we're doing a class comp study, which is inclusive of everybody. We did a class comp study for the chancellor, you know, 2 years ago while you were on the board. The 2% was part of a COLA that we provided to every single employee of the college. And correct me if I'm, Mr. Sylvan, that's correct, right? Is there anything you want to add on that particular issue for clarity's sake? Because there was some confusion.
Right. So in case there's confusion about that, the chancellor's contract itself did not include an increase in pay. The chancellor received the same 2% COLA as all employees as part of the budget package and compensation payroll that the board approved was a 2% for all employees and a one-time $1,000 payment. So that went to everybody. It wasn't unique to the chancellor, in case there's some misunderstanding about that.
I'm sorry, Jeff, but the only thing that I'm looking at is the fact that the chancellor gets to negotiate his contract. The other people don't. And I'm going to end it with that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any additional comments? Okay. Hearing none, we will adjourn the meeting. But again, I would encourage the individual board members to reach out to Chancellor Lambert in the next month and talk about if there are additional priorities or things that come up. Please reach out to him and really begin that dialogue so that when we hear the next plan, those things can be brought to everybody's attention and start to be wrapped into the overarching plan. But I just, again, I want in my final closing remark, I just want to say thank you to the entire team. I know it takes a lot of work to sort of vision and then actualize all of this and then put it into a budget framework. So thank you.